Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at the topic of war versus pacifism in our continuing study of biblical ethics. Francis Assisi gives, and I don't, this is attributed to him, he gives a prayer, Lord, make me an instrument of your peace. Where there is hatred, let me so love. Where there is injury, pardon. Where there is doubt, faith. Where there is despair, hope. Where there is darkness, light. Where there is sadness, joy. He goes on, O divine master, grant that I may not so much seek to be consoled as to console, to be understood as to understand, to be loved as to love. For it is in giving that we receive, it is in pardoning that we are pardoned, and it is in dying that we are born to eternal life. And his words suggest that perhaps our view of military and nations has been such that no matter what your view on this topic, we can agree that perhaps there have been too many times that wars have been fought. Pope John Paul, in an address in 2003, said something very similar. He said, war is never just another means that one can choose to employ for settling differences between nations. He went on to reiterate that war cannot be decided upon, and then he explained that we can't just go to war except as the very last option and in accordance with very strict conditions. And so his position was not to condemn all war, but to say, let's be careful before we go to war. Let's make sure that it is the last option, not the first, not an early decision to do so, that we take care before we go to war. This brings up the question, can one be a Christian and at the same time a patriot to his country? And I asked that question, notice, with these two American symbols, but let me turn the symbols instead and ask the same question, can one be a Christian and at the same time a patriot to his country? And you might be inclined to argue in a very utilitarian manner, well, that depends on the country and the one to whom one is being patriotic to. But then I would say you're not being patriotic to the country, you're being patriotic to maybe that which is representing the country at one given time, and that can change. Now, one who actually faced this was Dietrich Bonhoeffer. He was a German, a founding member of the Confessing Church in Germany. Didn't like the way that the state church was going. It was embracing Nazism and conforming itself to that. And so he said, no, we have to be separate. We're called to follow Jesus. And he actually helped Jews to escape to Switzerland, and because of that he was arrested, also accused of being part of a plot to assassinate Hitler. Now I don't know that if that's true or not. As far to the best of my knowledge, he never confessed that he had been involved in such a plot. But he was executed as a Christian, put to death in the closing days just before Germany finally fell. And so here's one who died for his faith, maybe for his involvement, or at least his accused involvement of this political intrigue. A quote that is attributed to him, he says, "To endure the cross is not tragedy. It is the suffering which is the exclusive fruit of an exclusive allegiance to Jesus Christ." In other words, I pledge allegiance not to this specific country or that specific country, but my allegiance ought to be to Jesus. After all, he is our King, and he is King of Kings and Lord of Lords over all nations. We've been called by Jesus to make disciples of all the nations. Now, in spite of that, Paul says in Romans chapter 13, and we cited this earlier on when we were looking at the question of capital punishment, but let's read it again. Chapter 13, verse 1, Paul says, "Every person is to be in subjection to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those which exist are established by God. Therefore, whoever resists authority has opposed the ordinance of God, and they who have opposed will receive condemnation upon themselves." So he's saying, be careful that you against resisting authority. resisting authority equals resisting God himself, since he has put authorities in power. Now the context of Paul's teachings is interesting when he is saying that about resisting authority. They had things in his day like slavery. There were dictators that were in power. There was taxation without representation. There was religious persecution. Nero, the Emperor Nero, was already in power. Had not necessarily started the persecutions that he would, but persecution would start shortly, whether Paul realized that or not. He goes on to say, chapter 13, verse 4, "For rulers are not a cause of fear for good behavior, but they're not a cause of fear for good behavior, but for evil. Do you want to have no fear of authority? Do what's good, and you'll have praise from the same. For it is a minister of God to you for good. But if you do what is evil, then be afraid." There's a time to not be afraid. There's a time to be afraid, for it does not bear the sword. And notice that reference to the sword. We took that earlier to talk about capital punishment, but it is not limited to that. That could be taken to apply also to the whole idea for warfare. For it is a minister of God, an avenger who brings wrath to the one who practices evil. So notice that governments you're not to have fear of authority if you're doing what's good. If you're doing what's evil, then you ought to fear them. If you are doing what's good, you'll have praise from the same, generally speaking. There are exceptions. Nero became one of those exceptions. But if you are going against authority, then you have a reason to be afraid. Authority is described as a minister of God to you for good, but it's also a minister of God and an avenger who brings wrath upon the one who practices evil, in the case of one who does evil. Now that works nicely in the case of capital punishment, but how does that apply when nations go to war and it's not quite so clearly indicated? Is the nation doing right? Is the nation doing wrong? Romans 13, verse 5, he goes on, "Therefore it is necessary to be in subjection, not only because of wrath, but also for conscience' sake. Because of this you also pay taxes, and those taxes can go to support a war, even an unjust war." Notice he says, "For rulers are servants of God, devoting themselves to this very thing, and therefore render all what is due to them, tax to whom tax is due, custom to whom custom, fear to whom fear, honor to whom honor," and so on. Now, back in the previous chapter, Romans chapter 12, Paul had discussed personal responsibility, but here he's discussing government responsibility and the responsibility of the believers to obey the government. In chapter 12, he said, "Offer your bodies as a living sacrifice." Here he says, "Be in subjection to the governing authorities." In chapter 12, he had said, "Never pay back evil for evil." He quoted that passage from the Old Testament, "Vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord." And God is saying, don't try to take it into your own hands. I have placed it into the hands of magistrates, and yes, even government. Magistrates on the local level, government in the international level. And then he says here in chapter 13, verse 4, "Government does not bear the sword for nothing. It's a minister of God, an avenger who brings wrath upon the one who practices evil." And yet we ask, sometimes does not government overstep its bounds, both with respect to local issues, but also with respect to national and international issues? And the answer is, of course, but that's not necessarily your concern. In chapter 12, we read the words, "Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good." In other words, act with goodness. In chapter 13, rulers are not a cause of fear for good behavior, but of evil. So do good. In chapter 12, he says, "Vengeance belongs to the Lord, and we're to give up our desire for vengeance against those who do wrong against us." Now, sometimes the Lord might use governmental situations to bring about that, but because vengeance belongs to the Lord, what are we to do about it? And the answer is in chapter 13, by being subject to the governing authorities, in whose duty it's their duty to be an avenger against the evildoer. Will they always carry that out correctly? No. But we leave that in the hands of the government. We leave that in the hands of God and those to whom he has delegated it. 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 13 and 14 also speaks about the use of government. Submit yourselves for the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether to as a king, as the one in authority, or to governors as sent by him for the punishment of evildoers and the praise of those who do right. So generally speaking, the ones who do right are praised. Generally speaking, evildoers are punished. It doesn't always work out that way, but that's what the design is for. But this brings up the question now, are there good and valid reasons for a nation going to war? But that's also going to bring up another question. Should Christians necessarily be involved in that process? Just because a nation can legitimately go to war does not necessarily mean that Christians should volunteer, or should they allowed to be drafted? Remember, drafting, that's being subject to the laws of your country. And those are actually two different situations. One is actively engaging in warfare. The other is going and saying, okay, I'm not actively engaging, but if you order me to, I will. And of course, even there are still options. There's the option of saying, yes, I will go to war, I will be shot at, but here, let me volunteer to serve as a medic and one who helps people instead of one who is actively trying to kill another person. Now, under just war theory, and we are thankful for Augustine, one of the he's not one of the apostolic fathers. He's one of the you talk about the early church fathers. He's a little bit later, in the late 300s and early 400s. First of all, that there should be a just cause for war. This would involve either defending your own country, or perhaps maybe coming to the defense of someone else who's being attacked. But the idea for a just cause, there must be a wrong that is suffered in order for a war to take place. That you should not go out just seeking war for its own benefit or to advance your country. You're responding to a wrong that was inflicted in one shape or another. So the first point is that there should be just cause if you're going to have a just war. Secondly, there should be a right intention. That is, the desire for peace should be the ultimate goal of war. Furthermore, the peace that's established after the war ought to be better than the peace that would have prevailed if the war hadn't been fought. And so the intention should be the intention of peace, and a better peace than if things had just worked themselves out on their own. So a just cause, a right intention. Thirdly, a reasonable chance of success. That it is considered to be wrong to go to war when the result will be certain catastrophe. Jesus actually alludes to this idea, Luke chapter 14, verses 31 and 32. Remember, he describes, and his main point isn't really about a parable, but it's the point about counting the cost of all things, of discipleship, of following him. And he describes a king who's preparing to meet another king in battle, who sits down and asks, gee, can I win this? Am I strong enough to win? If not, he goes and makes peace. It's common sense. But there ought to be a reasonable chance of success. So we have a just cause, a right intention, a reasonable chance of success. Next, the end is proportional to the means used to achieve it. I like the way somebody said, you don't use a bazooka to swat a fly. That would put holes in your house. That's silly. And so a proportionate means to achieve the end that is desired. So next, not just a proportional means, that war should be a last resort. It should only be used, remember Pope John Paul said the same thing, that it should be used when all other means have been exhausted. We are to pursue peace with all men. Romans chapter 14, verse 19, also Hebrews chapter 12, verse 14. We should be people of peace. Blessed are the peacemakers. A last resort, but also a legitimate authority, and that means that I don't declare war on somebody else. Myself and my neighbors do not declare war, but there should be legitimate authority that has been given. Now you say, well, there wasn't a free election. I don't care how they got it, but they are the recognized leaders of that nation. It is within their purview to administer war, to declare war. not just something I do on myself. I don't decide, gee, I don't like the people who live down the street, so I'm going to declare personal war on that. No. Which asks the question, were our American forefathers engaging in legitimate war when they rebelled against England? You see, the recognized authority, whether you like that authority or not, whether you agreed with the taxation or not, the recognized authority was the King of England. And because of that, there were quite a number of people, and there were quite a number of Christians, especially among the Methodists and Quakers, but there were others and Mennonites, but there were others as well who said, if the Bible calls us to be respectful to the nations and the rulers that God has put in authority, then maybe we should not be rebelling. Maybe we should not be declaring our independence. And so this question of legitimate authority. Now, I'm not saying that today we should go back to England. No, but the idea of a rebellion can be a very dangerous idea. So we have a legitimate authority, but also a distinction should be made between combatants versus non-combatants. In other words, I don't go just killing civilians. That they should not be targets. Now, they might be killed in the process, but that should not be my intention, and I should be careful not to target non-combatants. I should be careful not to target civilians. Do you remember during the maybe you're not old enough, but during the Vietnam War, there was a great to-do about the My Lai massacre, when a number of civilians were killed by American troops, and those American troops were taken and judged rather harshly, and that was appropriate because they had targeted civilians who were not combatants. Finally, there should be a public declaration. That is, the combatants should be given fair warning and the opportunity for avoidance by peaceful means. In other words, don't do what you're doing because we're going to go to war and we don't want to go to war, so let's fix this before we get there. Those are taking all those means. And then a public declaration of war. Now, not all countries have used this. There have been a number of countries. For example, our country was pulled into World War II after the Japanese did a bombing of Pearl Harbor. It seems to be that they had actually planned to declare war, but didn't get that announcement out in time, and so therefore it was a sneak attack, and that was considered not a just action on their part. The treatment of prisoners is an issue in just war. That combatants who have been captured are now rendered non-combatants, and so they should be treated as such. That doesn't mean you necessarily let them go, but it does mean that you don't just, in other words, their part in that war should be stopped, and now you treat them as prisoners of war, but you don't go out and continue to kill them. Now, it should be said with regard to Christians and our part in such activities, that we're told, Ephesians chapter 6, verse 12, that our struggle, you see, we're involved in a war, a spiritual war. But our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the powers, against the world forces of this darkness, against the spiritual forces of wickedness in heavenly places. The weapons of our warfare are not the same as the weapons that the natural world uses. Our weapons of warfare are things like prayer and the Word of God and speaking truth. And it's a different kind of warfare, and Jesus showed us how we are to exercise that warfare. Remember, he went to the cross, and he gave his life. And we are called to be willing to give our lives for the sake of our spiritual warfare. For we are on a mission to bring the world and make disciples throughout the world. It is a mission of warfare as we preach the good news of the gospel of a king who has conquered death for all time.